So the other thing that I wanted to bring up that you inspired, that's very often on my mind. I don't know how much you know about my story, but it's at one point I went to graduate school and studied in the business school. I did not get an MBA, but I did study in the business school on campus. And I remember coming from my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer working on human rights, as a PBS filmmaker who never had enough budget to do anything that was planned and had to find another way to do it, and as someone who briefly organized immigrant laborers who were getting abused. I was shocked how much what was called leadership development assumed transactional relationships. And it was about how to manage people who wanted to remain in that transactional relationship or dangling different transactional relationships with them. And I just come from, over 10 years international, never having the luxury of defending on transactional relationships. And so eventually I realized there were two very different ways of approaching leadership. One is, I don't know how to call it in the formal terms, but one is transactional, and the other one someone described to me as provisional. I'm providing an opportunity to make a difference. I'm providing you an opportunity to join a community working on values that you care about, and you're going to step into that if that provided opportunity is rich enough. You've been talking about leadership around the world for decades. I'm curious, when I describe that, what comes up for you is what you need to articulate or help people distinguish who are still conflating those different ways of approaching leadership, and by virtue of that are inflexible because they may be bringing a transactionally oriented leadership style into a context, board members, volunteers, fundraising, where even the tenor of a transactional relationship will toxify the cohesion of that team.
Yeah, or minimize its value or eliminate the collaboration or whatever. And I would take it back to, Charles, I'd take it back to context. Like, we as leaders have to read the room, right? And if we talk about it from the perspective of flexible leadership, in fact, one of the flexors that we talk about is transactional and interactional, right? Are there times where we can transact business and that's enough? Yes. Some of us are more comfortable there than others. Some of us may see that as our style. Some of us want to stay focused on the business. That's more on the transactional end of that spectrum. On the other end of that spectrum is more interactional. I love this idea of provisional, but interaction is deep, more, we're talking about more than work and weather, right? That's how I like to think about transactional versus interactional. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but I'm going to use this as the frame here. So there's a time, remember if my team calls me when we're finished with this conversation and they've got a challenge that they need help with, in that moment, all we might talk about is solving their immediate problem or giving them the resource they need. And it's going to be very transactional, very much about the work. But if that's all we ever do, then I think it's pretty safe to say that we won't be as successful collectively, outcomes and others, as we would be otherwise. And those some people might be very transactionally comfortable, transactionally focused. They have to be willing to flex across that continuum, because if they aren't, they're necessarily going to be less effective. And to your point, in some cases, it might end up becoming toxic. And so we have to recognize, and all of us know the person that they never get down to business, and it takes 22 minutes to do anything before. Yeah. And that's the wrong end of the continuum, just like never talking about anything other than work and weather is the wrong end at the other end. The ends of the continuum are almost always a problem, right? The extreme ends are almost always a problem. The right answer is somewhere in the middle, based on context and not based on our personal preference, but based on what is the situation required. Because you got some other people that, man, they want to be all about the interaction. They want to be all about the folks. They want to be about providing provision. And yet there's times when people, as where we started, they just need to know what we need to do right now. All contextual.
I think it's a wonderful framing. Both are important. There's a band there of efficacy, and we can notice when we or a team is leaning into the too transactional or the too relational. And of course, when we tend to too relational, what's happening is we disregard the importance or dismiss totally the importance of actual outcome.
Yeah, we're having a good time. We're not getting any work done.
So you touched on something that I want you to talk more about. I have my own thoughts on it, but I would love to hear how you articulate it. You said, Charles, if my team is all transactional all the time, we're probably not going to be as effective. I have my own thoughts, of course, given my expertise and why that is. I'm curious how you explain to someone who's confused about that, how that's an important part of that relationship and leadership.
Because work is done with humans, and humans don't only and always simply have transactions. Like, if you look at any sort of measure of greater long-term success, and if you have more trust, then you will have greater speed of trust. You'll have greater resilience. You'll have less turnover. You'll have like higher engagement. Like I could keep going. So if we just use that one thing, like if we only focus on transaction, we won't build trust. And if we don't build trust, we can't possibly be as good. Now I could use other examples, but that's all. That should be enough to drop the mic right there, actually.
Yes, that's where I go as well. Trust. The example I use in my work is, Kevin, if you and I show up in an emergency department with a loved one who needs attention right now, and we find out that that emergency team hasn't spent the time to learn the last names of each other, and they don't know who's in the middle of a divorce, and they don't know who's getting sued and who's worried about losing the house, we may have pause of how synced in that emergency room team is when things get really ugly. Maybe they can do a really good job, but if you don't know who was up late last night with a sick kid because they're going through a divorce, then you don't know who's weak and who's strong.
And again, in that moment might be different 2 weeks from Tuesday, but in that moment, having a level of being in tune with each other. There's teams that are in tune with each other. That doesn't mean that I'm not talking about groupthink. I'm talking about being in tune, a level of harmony that helps us not only work together better, but create better outcomes.